Newsnight returning to our top story now, and former President Thabo Mbeki trying to clarify his stance on HIV today. He says he always believed the virus could cause AIDS, but he claims it's just one part of the puzzle. Reaction now to the stories. We go live to Durban. Professor Salim Abdool-Karim is standing by for us, a leading researcher on HIV. Professor, good evening to you and thank you very much for joining us. President Mbeki saying that he never said HIV did not cause AIDS. He said that a virus cannot cause a syndrome. That's in his letter that was published online earlier today. Does that provide any more clarity in your opinion?
Well, I think the letter released today by Mbeki very cogently summarizes his AIDS dissident views and confirms that he remains firmly an AIDS dissident. He argues that he never said that HIV does not cause AIDS. But if he was going to release a statement like this, I would have expected at least he would say somewhere in this 3-page letter that HIV does cause AIDS. Well, no way. He meticulously avoids making that statement. He goes on to say that, he said that a virus does not cause a syndrome. Well, I'm sorry to say that that view is simply ill-informed. The reality is viruses do cause syndromes, and in this case, HIV, as one such virus, does cause a syndrome of a set of clinical conditions that we lump together as clinical presentations of underlying immune deficiency.
So he's added nothing further to his stance and really nothing further to the debate at all.
Yeah, there's nothing new in this. Having participated in the Mbeki presidential panel back in 2000, these were many of the issues we've discussed at the panel. We've outlined, we've answered them. He claims not to have received some of those answers. That's a pity. But I think it's very clear that when you look at the situation of his views, for example, let me give you an example. He chooses to quote a 2006 Stats SA report in which AIDS is listed as the 9th most common cause of death. Well, that's a decade-old report. If you look at the last 3 Stats SA reports, most recent of which I think is in about 2013, it very clearly shows that tuberculosis and HIV are the #1 and #2 causes of death. In fact, the World Health Organization's report on the causes of death in South Africa from 2013 clearly show tuberculosis and HIV as the top 2 causes of death. And tuberculosis in this country is predominantly associated with HIV anyway.
Professor, even though you're suggesting the argument is flawed or the interpretation is flawed about a virus not causing a syndrome, was it a debate that needed to be raised at the time? Let me quote from the letter. This is what President or former President Mbeki says. "I'm convinced that it would be perfectly understandable that the normal thinking African would ask the questions. Why did it come about that so much noise was made internationally about the leading cause of death in our country, with not even so much as a whimper about the leading cause of death worldwide, tuberculosis?"
So as a scientist, it's my duty to question everything. And I question conventional wisdom. I question things that people take for granted. Questioning is important. However, that should not be the basis on which the evidence at the time points to treatment being effective against HIV. I mean, if you look at what we've achieved since he has left, we had a mortality rate that has now been reduced drastically as a result of the provision of antiretrovirals. That should have been done way earlier, and he held that back. And unfortunately, it's when those kinds of distant views get translated into policy and prevent people from acquiring treatment that would save lives. That is unacceptable.
In 2010, Professor, Judge Edwin Cameron, and we are quoting him on this program tonight, saying that this was a case of ideology trumping facts. Was Judge Cameron correct in that respect?
I think he's spot on. I think, there's at one level, if you look at, for example, the report that Mbeki quotes, the Castro Shlongwane, caravans, cats, geese, foot and mouth and statistics, a report that is as obscure as its title suggests. if you look at those kinds of documents, it is really about a set of ideas, and it doesn't take into account the facts in the case, and it doesn't look at what is the scientific evidence. And we now know conclusively that HIV is responsible for the systemic destruction of CD4 cells that leads to immune deficiency, that leads in turn to a range of conditions like tuberculosis, like Kaposi sarcoma, pneumocystis carinii. So you can't posit a set of ideas that are not based on scientific data and fact and now try to refute what is known based on science.
Professor, given the progress, as you've suggested, that's been made during the Zuma administration, the fact that President Mbeki, or former President Mbeki, has jumped back into this debate and it's causing a fair amount of a conversation tonight, does it in fact matter at all, though? Is this important?
I think it's, his views are largely irrelevant. The fact that he's quoting reports that are from 30 years ago and 10 years ago indicates how out of touch he is with what the current situation is. In reality, right now, under Minister of Health, Aaron Motsoaledi, we've made amazing strides. What we have done is just nothing short of miraculous. From a situation less than 10 years ago, where 25% of babies were being born with HIV, to a situation now where it's almost less than 1%. We are saving thousands of babies' lives. That's what matters to me.
And just finally, Professor, is it possible, as some NGOs have suggested today, in spite of this very convoluted argument that we read online tonight, it would have been better perhaps for former President Mbeki simply to make an apology?
Well, when he started releasing these letters, I sort of questioned, is he actually going to release one on HIV? I thought, he'd probably steer away from it, given the nature of the controversy when he first raised these issues. And I thought, well, if he is going to release a letter, perhaps he'll release a letter that starts off by saying, HIV does cause AIDS. I was not quite correct in my views at the time, but here's what I tried to convey in that time, and I was misinterpreted. Well, nowhere in his 3 pages does he say HIV causes AIDS. And at the minimum, that's what I would have expected.
Thank you very much indeed. Professor Salim Abdool-Karim, live in Durban for Newsnight.